Hello and welcome to Sociology Chapter 7. This is really one of my favorite chapters, although I say that a lot. This chapter is on deviance and crime, right? So this is absolutely the fun stuff. So we start off with a bar graph, and just to set the table for a lot of our discussion. And the United States far and away leads the world in incarceration rates, right? So, meaning the percentage of US citizens who are incarcerated, who are in prison. And just so everyone knows, I don't think I'm going to ask you on the test, but just so you know, typically if someone is convicted of a misdemeanor, that's less than a year in what we call jail. If someone is convicted of a felony, the punishment is typically more than a year, and we call that prison, right? So if it's less than a year, we say jail, it's a misdemeanor. If it's more than a year, by and large, we say felony and we say prison. So, anyway, just if you hear me use those words, but I don't necessarily use them interchangeably, now you get a sense for what they mean. So to get a couple terms out of the way first, I want to talk about what norms are. Norms are rules, right? We used to go into folkways and mores, and you don't have to worry about that stuff anymore. But just know as norms are rules. Deviance, on the other hand, I want you to know deviance a couple different ways. First of all, the easiest way to think about it is deviance is breaking a rule, right? That's an easy. If you're going down the Kennedy doing 95 and the speed limit is 70, that's speeding, right? That's breaking a rule. Deviance, on the other hand, and this is a point that I really want to drive home, deviance is defined by others. And what I mean by that is two people can do exactly the same act, and it's deviant for one, and it's not deviant for someone else, right? So uh, we're we're familiar we're familiar with DWB, right? Driving while black, and so people who are African American, particularly young men, are pulled over at significantly higher rates than others. There's actually Illinois did a study on this 15 years ago. There's studies all across the country. This is a real thing, right? This is absolutely a real thing. But let me give you a slightly different scenario. Years ago, some friends and I were walking through Water Tower Place, right? Nobody goes to malls anymore, but anyway, especially with COVID. Uh, but we were walking through Water Tower and we walked by a jewelry shop. And in the jewelry shop was a young, attractive couple buying something. And they had what I thought was a 4-year-old daughter who, at this point in her life, is bored out of her mind in the jewelry store. So here's what she's doing. You know how they always have the glass walls so that you can see in and see the goodies, right? But you still can't break in. So that's what they do with jewelry stores. So what the little 4-year-old girl was doing is she was plastered up against the glass, just making faces at everybody who goes by. It's funny. You laugh. You make faces back. It was actually quite the spectacle. It was pretty funny. When we were taking a cab back, it occurred to me that what if that would have been a 45-year-old, fully grown man plastered up against the glass, making faces at everyone who walks by? Is that funny? It's actually a little scary, maybe a little bit freaky. So it's not deviant for the 4-year-old girl to do it. It's clearly deviant for the 45-year-old, fully grown man to do it. And I know that's an extreme example, but I want to give you a flavor of how this works. And so deviance is defined by others. We're going to go through a number of theories, and I want you to know a couple things. For each theory, I want you to know what it says. And also for each theory, I want you to know what's wrong with it, because there is no theory which accurately predicts who's going to be deviant and who is not. Right? We have a couple theories that are kind of nice after the fact to explain things, but we don't have anything that's predictive when it comes to this. So the first theory we want to talk about is biological theory, right? And so what biological theory says is that someone's DNA or someone's genetics influences them to go into a life of crime. There have been a number of theories of this through the years. none of them hold water, right? A couple theories talked about, body types, and the people that had a more athletic body type were more likely to do this kind of crime, and people with a less athletic body type were more likely to do this other kind of crime. No, that's not that's just not how it works. So biology really does not influence, outside of men are significantly more likely to commit crime than women are. Outside of that, we really don't see biology having a lot to do with this. This isn't a theory so much as an explanation. Um, Psychopaths, right? Do we have psychopaths in this world? Sure we do, right? Now, what's interesting with psychopaths is they really try to blend in, right? I mean, the whole idea with the career that they choose, the job they choose, where they live, they really want to be in a situation where they blend in and they don't stand out, because they choose those things so that they can really do the harm in, whether it's sexually exploiting someone, killing someone, right? But this is what we see with psychopaths, and so I'm not sure we would all recognize a psychopath if we met them, right? That's really the point with that. Let's talk about Durkheim's enemy theory, right? And so what this means is we're talking about people who do not have strong ties to family, to friends, to a job. So they just don't have the times and the ties. And so what Durkheim is telling us is that when people don't have these ties, that oftentimes that leads to crime. And the reason for that is if you don't have ties to a society, then you really don't care whether you follow their rules or not. Many years ago, it was cool for someone to say, I don't live by anybody else's rules. I hope that was just bravado when people said that, because if true, if you really don't care about anyone else's rules, you're going to break them, right? Or you're going to break at least one of them. And so that's what anomie is. It's just not being tied to a particular society. Look, we're going to talk in a few minutes about how ties to family and career hopefully keep us on the straight and narrow and conform. Not always, right? We have an awful lot of examples of people who had everything to lose and did crazy things anyway. So, but anomie is the opposite of that. I mean, it's on the same track, and we're just saying that people without the ties may be a little less likely. So Merton has 5 typologies in here, and we're calling this structural strain theory. Now, here's the thing. I'm not going to ask you to memorize all 5. I want you to get the gist of this. So, structural strain theory essentially blames an awful lot of crime on poverty, right? So, let me give you an example. Many of us we have goals, right? Now our goals probably differ, but on some level they're pretty similar. I mean, people want to have a nice career, live in a nice home, drive a nice car, and have a nice family. Now, those things differ from person to person. For one person, a nice home is a $2 million home in Kenilworth. For someone else, a nice home is an apartment that has a pool. So, so we have to take relativity into this. But having said that, people have goals. What we're focused on in structural strain theory is how people achieve those goals. You're taking a college class. That is the accepted means of achieving a goal. And so, you work hard, you get an education, and hopefully that turns itself, and it likely will, into a well-paying career that you're satisfied with. But what if you recognize early on that this whole school thing isn't working out, and a friend of yours who dropped out of school is making an awful lot of money right now, And it's because they're selling rock or something like that on the side, but they're driving a Beamer, right? They have an expensive car, they're flashing cash all the time. What if the thought crosses your mind that you think, I still want all the nice things, but I'm just never going to be able to afford them, so I'm going to cheat so I can get those things. That's structural strain theory, right? For those of you who have read and or watched the book musical Les Miserables, right? Jean Valjean, to feed his family, steals a loaf of bread. That's structural strain theory, right? I mean, his family needed to eat, so he just thought, you know what, it's worth it taking the chance to steal this bread because then I can feed my family. I think we can use this type of thinking a lot of different ways. So, for example, I don't know how much money you make. I don't know if you have a full-time job, a part-time job. Let's just make it easy. Let's say you're making 30 grand a year right now. If you're making 30 a year, I can almost guarantee what you're thinking. God, if I just made 35, right? If I just made 35, I could pay my bills, have a little left over. Life would be so much easier. Then you're making 35. Now, what are you thinking? Oh, if I just made 40, right? So, in a capitalistic society, people are almost, when we make more money, we spend more money. And then you're always, it doesn't matter how much you make if you're spending more. If you spend more than you make, bad things bad things are going to happen. So I think each of us kind of gets the essence of structural strain theory. What's wrong with this theory? Well, look, most poor people don't steal. I mean, it's really that simple. So, so this is a nice theory after the fact. So when someone has committed a crime and you're like, oh, well, this is why they did it. But what it doesn't say is that why, by and large, most people who are poor don't commit crimes, right? So that's the part that gets left out. Edwin Sutherland, um, I call it social learning theory. Actually, put that in the overhead. So, but social learning theory or differential association. Again, I like to call it social learning theory. Maybe a better theory is mom theory. But here's how that theory goes. Has someone in your family, an uncle, an aunt, a mom, a father, has someone in your family ever said to you, I'm a little concerned about the group of people that you're hanging out with, right? They might be a little more deviant than I would prefer. Here's the bad news. Your family member's probably right, right? I mean, that's what social learning theory, differential association is about. It's about learning to be deviant from people who are more deviant than you are, and that's what it's about. Years and years ago, I worked at a halfway house for teens who were coming out of drug treatment centers, and this was the final stop before they either went to foster care or hopefully they were going home. And I worked with one kid early in the summer when I got out of school, so May, and he seemed like a nice kid. He had some addiction issues, and he actually went home. And then right before I went back to school, my last night, he was back. He was back, and so I asked him. I said, "What happened? It seemed like you had your act together. It seems like you were going in the right direction." He said, "Well," he said, "I have to tell you." He said, "When I was in the drug treatment center, I roomed with a guy who was teaching me how to break into a house and not make a sound with glass cutters." And he said, "I had to try it." So he and a buddy of his, in the middle of summer, broke into a candy store. They had overcoats on because they wanted the long pockets, and they used the glass cutters to go through the picture window to get into the candy store, not realizing the second they walked into the store that an internal alarm went off. So they brought baseball bats in with them, and you know how this works. The coin machines, you put the coin machine in, you turn it, and candy comes out. Well, they bashed those with the baseball bats. There's money everywhere, candy everywhere. They didn't take a dime. They just loaded their pockets up. They're like 13, 14, 15 years old. They just stuffed their pockets with candy. They heard the cop sirens and ran. when he went to bed that night, I had to look up his file, right? I just thought, I have to see what happened. And, and the arresting officer said that all they did was follow a trail of candy to find these two kids hiding after breaking into the candy store. So I tell the story, one, because I think it's funny and you might remember it, and two, that's social learning theory, right? I mean, that's so. This was a kid who had some deviancy issues to begin with, but he roomed with someone who was more deviant than he was, and he became more deviant as a result of it. That's exactly what social learning theory is. What's wrong with this theory? Don't we all have friends who are a little bit deviant, right? And doesn't mean we are. Have you ever made a joke to one of your friends? Hey, I'll visit you in prison, right? I mean, or I'll come visit you in jail. So just because you have a friend who may stray from the path every once in a while doesn't mean that you do. And that's right. So again, you can see the benefit of the theory. You can also see the hole in the theory. Oh, here we go. Labeling theory. Labeling theory is about why it is so difficult for someone who has been labeled as deviant to go straight. And it almost doesn't matter what they do. So let me explain this. So there's two kinds of deviance under labeling theory, under the umbrella of labeling theory. There's primary deviance and secondary deviance. Primary deviance is whatever it is that gets you labeled as deviant. It could be something that you've done. It could be something that you should have done that you didn't do. It could be the color of your skin, the piercings that you have, the ink that you have, the way that you dress, your accent, where you're from, any of those things. But whatever it is that gets you labeled as deviant, that's primary deviance. Secondary deviance is when someone starts to accept that, right? I mean, people are consistently calling you deviant, and so sometimes people just internalize that. Oh, that's a problem. Oh, that's a problem. So, okay, I want to talk about control theories within deviance. So, what control theory says? Well, think of it this way: when you go to the store, do you lock your car doors? Right? When you're at home, do you lock your house or apartment doors? You probably do, right? And look, when we lock our car doors when we go somewhere, who are we keeping out? We're keeping out the high school kid that wants to go for a joyride. Are we keeping out a professional car thief? No, we're not. If a professional car thief wants our car, no matter what alarm we've purchased, they're gone in just a few seconds. So what control theory says is that we want to deny someone the opportunity and the motivation. So we deny opportunity by locking our car door when we go to the mall. Have you ever had one of those trips to the mall where you buy so many things that you have to take them out to the car, put them into your car so you can go back in and buy more stuff? Well, when we do that, where do we put the packages? We probably put them in the trunk, right? Because we don't want people to see them. My favorite is when someone places them in the back seat and then puts a coat over them, right? Because nobody knows what's under that coat. That's not really denying, that's still motivating someone to break into your car, right? So, what control theory says is we want to deny the opportunity as much as we can by locking the door, and we want to deny the motivation. So, we don't want to put things out in broad daylight where people can see them and take them, right? Theory of broken windows. This was a big deal in New York about 20 years ago, not so much today. So here's the way the theory of broken windows goes. If you crack down on the small stuff, you don't have as much big stuff. And so with Times Square, for example, 20 years ago in New York, they really started cracking down on, just people who were pickpockets and just all these little petty crimes. But by cracking down on those things, they actually saw throughout the city, they saw their overall crime rates go down. Now, the economy got better, and there were probably other things that were impacting it as well. But that's the theory of broken windows. So if you see that, I'm not going to test you on it, but if you see that, That's what it refers to. One of the things we see in our reading are national crime victimization surveys. So I want to compare that to something. The FBI does what's called the UCR every year. The UCR is the Unified Crime Report, and it tracks the biggies. It tracks homicide, robbery, burglary, rape, right? Those sorts of things. It tracks the big crimes. And what we notice is that when we do victimization surveys, we find out that there's typically double the number of crimes that then were reported through the FBI crime report. Now, this isn't the FBI. So what happens is every police precinct in the country reports their crime statistics to the FBI. So, right, so this isn't the White House, doesn't have anything to do with this kind of stuff. This has been done for decades. So what we typically see, however, is we typically see in victimization surveys, we see significantly more crime than we do crime that was actually reported to the police. Why is that? Well, look, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, one, there may be a crime against you, and you may decide, I don't really want to call the police because I have my own skeletons in the closet, right? So I'm not going to call the police because I don't want anybody snooping around my stuff. In some communities, there's a policy of the police have been mean to us for generations, so we're not going to help the police, right? So we have some of that. We even have some homes in Chicago who put signs in the window. Have you seen these? Who put signs in the window that say, "We will call the police," right? And so what they're trying to tell the potential thief is, don't break into my house because I'm going to call the police, break into somebody else's house. So there's all kinds of little tricks that people try to do with this, but there's a number of crimes every year that are just simply not reported to the police. Gender and crime. Well, look, most people who commit crimes are men, and also look, most people who commit crimes are young men. I probably get the second one a little more than I used to. And what I mean by that is right now, whatever time you're watching this, there's probably some 40-year-old guy sitting in his lazy boy watching Sports Center, and he's thinking to himself, boy, I'd really like to rob a bank today. When Sports Center's over, maybe I'll go, right? So he just doesn't have the energy that he used to. Sad but true, right? My recovery from workouts now, it's not what it used to be. Anyway, that's just what it beats the alternative, right? So I'll take the longer recovery than the opposite of that. So we're seeing more women commit crimes. I don't know if we should be congratulating ourselves for that, but we are seeing more women commit crimes. We're not seeing fewer men, so it's not that it's fewer men and more women. We're continuing to see a lot of men and more women commit crimes. And part of the crimes that we're seeing people commit are during the course of their job. So on slide 24. You have white collar crime. So let me give you the most basic kind of white collar crime. And again, white collar crime is crime committed during the course of your job. Embezzlement is probably one of the most common, if not the most common, types of white collar crime. And so you have someone with access to the books, with access to the money, and they skim a little off the top, right? A dollar for the company, a dollar for me. A dollar for the company, a dollar for me. And then they try to hide it. Well, eventually you're going to get caught through an audit or whatever. But people, and sometimes particularly people with gambling issues, will borrow money from the company to pay off their gambling debt. And then they think, well, I'll just pay it back, right? Because I'll hit a hot streak. And then they keep doubling down and they go deeper in debt and deeper in debt. And in turn, taking more money from the company, more money from the company. Think about how many stories you've heard of high school youth trips to DC or to somewhere, and one of the parents was the treasurer in charge of the money. No one knew they had a gambling issue because they hid it very well. They seemed like a wonderful person. and a week before the trip, they find out that $30,000 has been stolen, and no one's going on the trip this year. That's happened way too many times here in the northwest suburbs. Uh, People are people, right? But yeah, so embezzlement is probably the most common kind of crime that we see when it relates to white collar crime. The other thing I want to say about white collar crime is we don't always think of white collar crime as being dangerous, right? We typically think of things like embezzlement where somebody's just messing with the books, as they say. White collar crime does result in death. Years and years ago, and there's a memo called the Pinto memo, which is in your course materials. In the 70s, Ford had been doing great, right? They had come out with the Mustang. It was a muscle car. Mustangs are back now, but they were doing great with the Mustang. And then OPEC was formed. The price of oil tripled almost overnight, and people suddenly became very interested in miles per gallon. And what Ford did, because they had done so well with the Mustang, is they came out with a cheaper car, which was better on gas. And they decided, well, let's stay with the horse theme, and they went with Pinto. Before the first Pinto was ever sold, Ford knew that it had a propensity to explode, gas vehicle, had a propensity to explode when hit from behind. And the occupant's pretty good chance of death when that happens. It was going to cost, this is going to surprise you, it was going to cost about $11, just a little more than $11 per car to fix it. Now that doesn't sound like a lot, right? But when you're talking about millions of cars, so here's what happened. Uh, Ford had actuaries, their statisticians, figure out how many cars did they think they would sell. Of that, how many of those cars would be in accidents, how many people would die, what would they have to pay out, what would they have to pay out in lawsuits from that. So they came up with two numbers. To fix the car was going to cost somewhere around $150 million. To not fix the car and just pay out the lawsuits was going to be about a third of that, about $50 million. If you're the CEO of Ford, what's your primary job? Your primary job is to put money in the pockets of stockholders. So they made a business decision and they put profit over life. We're not well equipped to punish companies when they do this sort of thing. I mean, look, Ford's still in business. As a matter of fact, for the marketing people in the room, the tagline for Ford very soon after the Pinto was, "Have you driven a Ford lately?" Everybody knew what that meant. They were saying, we're not making Pintos anymore, right? We're making better cars. Quality is job one. And think about the top selling cars in the country today. In the 80s, the number one selling car in the world was the Escort, Ford Escort. In the 90s, the number one selling fleet car was Ford Taurus. What's always been one of the top three sport utility vehicles has been the Ford Explorer. Ford's done just fine, right? None of the people who worked for Ford were convicted of any crimes. The company had to pay a fine. So we're not good yet at how to handle it when a company makes this kind of decision, right? We just haven't figured it out yet. So white collar crime has continued. And again, the reason I point this one out is I want you to know that white collar crime can be just as dangerous as other crimes. I mean, what we're scared of, let's be honest, what we're scared of is someone putting a gun in our face. That's scary. It's not putting a gun in our face when we're driving a car that has a propensity to explode, but it's really the same thing, right? So anyway, just want to make that clear. Okay. Are prisons the answer, right? This is a really difficult. Again, we lead the world. We, meaning the United States, leads the world by far in incarceration rates. And so, do prisons work? Well, here's one. Do you know where prisons come from? Um, the original idea was a religious one. The idea was that when your life was going the wrong direction and you wanted to be penitent, you would put yourself into isolation. You would put yourself into prison and you would stay there as long as you thought you needed to. You would read whatever Bible that you read and you would think about your life. And when you thought you had some answers, you would leave. So people took what was a pretty interesting concept and turned it into what we have, right? What we have today. And that's just so many people in prison. Women who return from prison have a pretty good chance of fitting back into life. Men who are released from prison are significantly less likely to be successful reintegrating. And so the word is recidivism, right? Recidivism. You might see that again, so you might want to pay attention to it. But what recidivism means is that's the percentage of people released from prison who end up right back in prison again. And for men, it's over half, right? I mean, it's a very high number. There's all kinds of reasons for that. People go back to the same friends, to the same area that they came from. You know, it's difficult to get a job when you have a felony conviction. Every job application that you fill out, it's called the box in Chicago, but every application you fill out asks this question: have you ever been convicted of a felony? Yes or no? Please explain. When I worked, and I'm not going to give you the full story since we're on the COVID, but I worked with people coming out of prison who were in prison for quite a while, years and years ago, when I was a student. And we encouraged them, and they do the same thing today. Safer Foundation in the city is probably the largest group to do this. But we encourage them not to check yes or no, but to simply write, "will explain an interview." Well, everybody knows what that means, right? I mean, but it's not as harsh. It's not as harsh as seeing yes checked for felony conviction. So, but it's hard, right? And I will tell you, one of the times in my life that was a little scary for a moment, but it turned out to be a moment that I will never forget. So, when I was a grad student, I had a summer gig one summer just delivering mail, right, for a little while. And I was vacation relief, and I was in Indianapolis, and I'm delivering mail. And I had this cab stop very close to where I was, and a very large man got out of the cab, and he's running towards me. And I thought, oh crap, he can, he's big enough to snap me in half. And then he starts yelling my name. I didn't recognize him at all. He was in my class in prison. And he was so excited to show me that he had a job and that he was doing well. And I have to tell you, all these years later, I love it. I will never forget that. So, anyway, great guy. I hope things have really worked out for him. So that is our chapter on deviance. I hope you have a fantastic day, and I will see you soon.